Hi, welcome to my talk about Federated API Management. When you look at the slide, you see this iteration 4, so there are three others iteration already available. And this time, because Federated API Management is such a complex topic, we look at teams, policies, and the case of ownership. So my name is Daniel Kocot. I'm a principal API consultant at Codecentric. I'm also an API Ops Cycles facilitator. I'm an ASIN API ambassador, TSC member also. I'm a team topologist advocate, and I'm an open data product specification TSC member. So you see a lot of things I do beside working with customers really related to open source work and to work with things like team topologies there. So the organizational stuff. But we start now directly. So quick recap, where we are coming from. Actually, this whole thing started in last September when there was somehow API Days London. And everybody was actually upfront talking about this Federated API Management, API Federation, or whatever we call it actually. But it was not really clear what it's actually all about, because when you talk to a vendor, it's mostly vendor specific when they talk about federation. But federation is actually a response to the complexity and the decentralized teams thing, and actually having a multi-cloud and maybe being in an API sprawl, so really sprawl around. So the key concepts of federation are really autonomy, scalability, and strategic governance. So nothing really too related. So it's really about to say, okay, you can do anything what you like in your own autonomy. We will make it scalable and you will be governed. And for that, there was the second iteration, being in Paris last year and talking about a framework. Maybe you saw some things in my introduction. Yeah, we hit some of these things. So in the end, federated framework is a nearly 5-step thing or framework or whatever we call it actually to get into the mood of having federation available for APIs. The first step of this federated framework is actually assess the current API ecosystem. Yeah, this is the first thing you should do. What is already there? And that could be very interesting. Then we really should define and design the framework, what is really needed. Maybe you should also think about, when it comes to API designing, to incorporate Codecentric's own methodology of API thinking together with API ops cycles. So this is the whole trick in it. So getting the things together actually, and then deploy the framework. So they are not real steps into define and design the framework. When you go deeper into this iteration, you get more information about what is actually happening. The fourth step is really about deploying the stuff. And then when it's really running, you get the people and building APIs and so on. So it's about monitoring and success factors. So really say it's about business success for this way. In Helsinki, we looked at something around the interface API interaction patterns. So different types of interactions actually when we use APIs or interfaces. It might help us to use the API ops cycles interaction canvas. And having interaction patterns available or making interactions possible, we might need to have a platform available. So maybe it's good to describe the platform via the platform canvas. How platform canvas? We are now hitting actually organizational structure. Because when we look at federation, it's not really just about, we do this multi-gateway setup type of thing. So it's really about having teams, ownership, and policies. So this is the real operational federation. So getting into runtime behavior is not longer a platform concern. So it really matters to the teams how the API behaves on runtime. And again, it's really missing link for all of this is really about organizational clarity. So I have to be very clear who is doing what. So we learned already that it's all about runtime behavior, actually. Yeah, we have a platform. So with interactions, they are running at runtime. So for this, we really have to think about, the contracts are interesting. What is an API doing? But it would be also interesting to see how it behaves actually. So when we look at the hidden gap between these two things, it's really about, we can really define how a contract works or what the contract actually does. So we have Open API for REST interfaces. We have Async API for event-driven interfaces. We have GraphQL SDL for query schemas. We have protocol buffers for RCP interfaces. And with this, we define structure and consumer expectations. What is actually the consumer expecting to happen when they interact with the API actually? To be honest, we cannot define consistently a lot of other things. So it's about authentication, authorization. Yeah, we can describe it somehow, but do you really know, is it working or not? So it's really just a description what authentication, authorization rules are actually hitting. We can describe how rate limiting is working and so on and so on, but we don't have the consistency into it. So there's no real cross interaction specification. So everything is high vendor specific in that way. So we can describe what an interface does, but not how it behaves. And this is actually the missing link. So federation actually requires also distributed ownership. It's not about shared control. So a lot of people think when they do federation, it's about how we're sharing the control thing. It's this little tiny control plane type of thing. So every vendor, when you go to every vendor in the market, it's really like, oh yeah, we have a control plane. Yeah, nice. But that's not federation. Federation is actually about having distributed ownership. So it's really about to have a look at this distributed owner model. When you look there, it's really about the shared platform layer. We have the policy execution, we have discovery, and we have the observability parts in it. But when we look at different domains, we have an API contract and we have a policy intent. So this is really what we can guide people to actually create. We can guide them to create an API contract. We can guide them to create a policy intent. What is really actually happening? So key takeaways out of this: federation is not about shared ownership. Each domain owns and defines its contract and policies, and a platform enables it, doesn't dictate something. And we need clarity in who owns what. The foundation actually is of the scalable API governance. We talked about organization. And we talked about clarity actually here. So it's actually a good time to introduce team topologies into the scene. So we have a platform, we have consumers, we have providers. So we really need to think how team topologies could be placed into that. So with team topologies, we're looking actually, to be honest, more on the provider side. So we've streamlined teams, we have an enabling team, we have complicated system teams, we have platform teams. And when we look at the teams description, actually, it's really important to know what their role in an API context really is. So the streamlined team is responsible for developing and managing APIs in their specific domain. And this team also ensures that APIs are closely aligned with business needs and user requirements. So they're doing the thing, the plumbing work, and so on and so on. The enabling team on the other side is really going into the scene by providing guidance and best practices on API design, security, and performance. And they also facilitate the adoption of new technologies, methodologies, and API development. So this is the team which is really doing the upskilling thing. So we know that everybody in the organization, programming stuff, developing things, is good at several kind of T-shape things. But APIs or the design of APIs is a really complex situation. And you have to really know all the essences to get to the best used API, to have a good API design, and so on and so on. So this is the enabling team covering this up for you. Then we have this complicated subsystem team, which is handling complex API integration and really critical API components they're dealing with. So it's really managing complicated dependencies and high technical demands. And then there is this platform team, which provides the infrastructure, the tooling, the frameworks for developing and deploying APIs. And the team also ensures that the API management platform, whatever it will be, supports scalability, security, and monitoring. So now we know all the teams involved there. And we know that we now are like to talk about policy, the policy, because this is what we are lacking. We know how to write a contract, but what about policy? And in regards of thinking about the API contract, it's the same with API policy. It's about ownership. So the runtime policy is a product of team intent. Yeah, we really think about how, we have this policy, so we have a behavioral contract. So the team must own its own policy intent. So nobody can tell the team what to do. They can only be said how to use the things, how to get into the mood of policy, and so on and so on. And with looking at the platform owns the execution, not the intent. So the teams really have to focus on the intent. So the streamline team really defines the access model, the rate limits, the header policies, and so on. And the platform team is just enforcing the things. So in regards of rate limiting, it's really about having a ready API config available so that everybody can use this configuration or made able to create some kind of configuration. So now you can argue actually that we already have something in there. Yeah, we have the extensions already available. So with OpenAPI and Async API, we have these X- extensions where we are possible to describe things that are not standardized to really say, okay, it's possible to describe it. But to be honest, it's a metadata hack. It's not a runtime strategy because nobody can really test these things. We can lint them and say, okay, it's there, but we really actually don't know if it's really working. So there is this kind of illusion of policies in description. So because this illusion comes up, we have no standard vocabulary available. And they are there, but they are not executable. And the bad thing, they're also not portable. Because when we look at this example, it's really about, okay, the X- rate limit would be portable somehow if the gateway used are able to understand request and period. But with this X- Kong plugin key -off, it's really Kong related. So I need to have a Kong gateway. But what happens if there are other gateways available? We really have to look at it, and we have to write mappings and so on and so on. So this doesn't really work. And actually, to be honest, sometimes things happen on purpose. And some weeks before the API Days in Munich, there was a post. So as mentioned, sometimes things happen on purpose. So there was a conversation starting on LinkedIn actually some days before upfront the API Days Munich. It was Maxim Kogan coming up with an open API policy. An open policy specification is maybe needed, like we have the open API description there. So, but what would this open policy specification really enable? Yeah, it's about really having the runtime portability across products and vendors. So it would really something that is actually needed because we have different products, different vendors, and they don't talk with each other on this. And we would have a shared understanding between teams and platforms. And we would really define clear team boundaries there. So the API team still defines what policies, and the platform still only enforces how to deal with these policies. But that's not all. With this discussion coming up by Maxime, it was Rahim Amin who stepped in and said separation of duties is actually the key in federated enforcement. And we already have tooling there. So there is something available. And we all maybe know the open policy agent. So this is something where we have to look at, because the open policy agent, short terms OPA, allows policies to be written in a declarative language called Rego. So where we can really version this like source code and test these policies in CI/CD pipelines. So we can review them and maintain them alongside API definitions, which is actually really good because this is what we are all looking at, automation. So maybe that we get the 80% automation and so on and so on. With the separation of duties, the stream-aligned teams write the policy intent. And the platform teams now have to integrate APA with the existing infrastructure. So we now have the clean separation between interface and the deployment actually on the other side. So, and to get you there actually, because it's really hard just to do it theoretically, we have some kind of use case. So a team A defines a rule, only internal services can access this API. The rule is offered in Rego, stored in Git. The gateway, whatever it is, queries Opera at runtime to decide access. So we don't have to define something in every specification or build something in every for including in every specification. So we really have something there. And to give you a glimpse of an implementation, this is how it looks like. It's actually that small that you don't get really the intent to this. So you really have to look at Opera and understand how it really works. Looking into the federated approach, it's really like to look that Open Policy Agent supports multi-tenant policy control. It supports domain-specific roles. It's about centralized logic with decentralized enforcement. And it's really supporting the portable and auditable decision model. So we can really build something that becomes portal. So we can really use it with other teams if we see that this policy intent is needed by someone else. With this policy as a code thing, so a lot of people talked about it, even I at the beginning of 2020, it's getting reality because we have now the possibility to organize such things. When we look on the organizational level from an enterprise architecture structure or view, it's really that we have the teams up on, and we have an API policy lifecycle again, where it's really about the defining of the policy intent by side, the definition of the API contract. We have an enforcement of the policy, and we have to monitor and evolve the policies over time to see what is actually needed and what might be used by the shared infrastructure. So gateways and the policy management system, which is then connected to the gateway so that we don't have to send both things to the gateways, really actually happening the separation of concerns here. And in the end, when we deal with federation, is federation nothing more than runtime coordination. So everything that is happening on runtime is something that we can have to coordinate really to talk about federation. So it's really about interface contracts define what an API does. Behavioral policies define how the API should act. Platforms enforce behavior without owning the logic, because the logic is in the policies. And with this, we have clear separation of concerns, and which are actually enabling runtime trust. Because people that use this, the platform, the APIs on the platform on both sides, will really get trust into this situation. As always, if you do such things like that, it's always that you have anti-patterns that will really break federation at that point. So it's really about centralizing review of a scaling strategy. We have a platform team as the policy owner. So as we had in former times, a platform team is dealing with everything. Now they are the policy owners. We have specification extensions without exclusions. So if somebody says, I put everything in the specification in the specification description, it will not work. And policy ownership ends at delivery. So when something is delivered, the team turns away from the policy and says, it's working, it's fine. Not the best thing actually to do. Federated infrastructure without federated responsibility is the fifth actually anti-pattern. And for me, the really biggest anti-pattern is the runtime and design disconnect. So I design something which is not connecting to the runtime, so that we have unexpected behavior, no shared language between contract owners and infra owners, and so on and so on. It's really about that. So to break it all up, to sum it all up, it's really about that teams must own API contracts and behavior contracts. The platform should only enable, not control, and we need a shared language. And something for you to take home is your organization empowered to own API behavior or just the interface? Thank you for watching and see you at any API days that will come.